Hello, everybody.
Iñaki in any second. We're waiting for Iñaki to join. Hello,
Hello, Jaime.
hola.
Happy to see you. How are
Happy to
you?
see you. Hi, how are you, Iñaki? Thank you so much
Fi-
for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this interesting experience. The
Yeah,
first one that I am actually invited to be part of. So thank you so much, America Society and Jaime for this wonderful opportunity to keep on showing and sharing our work, even though the difficult circumstances we are living in right now.
thank you so much. And so, for those of you who don't know, Iñaki is based in Mexico City. He's talking from there. Iñaki's practice is, basically, I hate these titles, I hate these labels, and we're having a very informal talk, so I can say that. But, he's a conceptual artist, much more than only a conceptual artist, but he has a lot of practice around ideas of photography, archive, memory, and he's gonna try to focus his presentation today with us about a project that was meant to be on public view now, but hopefully it'll be able to be on view soon. Um, so I don't know if you want to tell us a little bit about it, Iñaki.
Exactly, sure. It was an exhibition that it was meant to open on March the 13th,
Hmm.
and sadly I couldn't make it to the opening, although the gallery managed to open the show
Okay.
just to close it down the next day. So I am really thankful to those few visitors that managed to attend the opening on the 13th.
Nice.
What I'll be showing you guys today, I haven't seen it physically myself, at least how the work looks installed in the gallery space. So the gallery space we're talking about, I don't know if I mentioned this before, it's a gallery in Berlin that I've been working with since 2010. It was my second solo show at the location they have in Berlin, because they have also locations in Stockholm where I've also done a show in the past, and also one in Mexico. But this exhibition that I'll be guiding you through was my second show in the Berlin headquarters. So maybe I should switch the camera to the computer and show you some images, and maybe add a little bit of context to where this comes from.
Okay, please do. That would be amazing.
So what you are actually seeing here
Mm-hmm.
are six binders,
Mm-hmm.
binders number 25 to number 30, uh, of a photographic collection, a little history of photography, one could say, that I inherited on behalf of my maternal grandfather, who used to abbreviate his name as J.R. Plaza. And sadly, he passed in the year 2000. And I went on living back then with my grandmother. She used to be a painter, and we got along tremendously well. I moved in with her for a year, and it was on that occasion that I started to get familiarized with this little treasure that my grandfather had built during his entire life, and had kept it quite secretly, quite quietly, almost just for himself. And as earlier to this period, I had been the assistant of a very well-known photographer in Mexico, Carlos Omonte, who happens to be my uncle as well. So there's an interesting connection between photography and family issues, so to speak. And when you are the assistant of a photographer, you basically take care of everything that surrounds photography, but you never really get to take the picture. That's the job of the photographer. And that boundary, I never really dared to surpass it. I felt much more comfortable, I have to say, working with the elements that surround photography, with more marginal aspects of the photographic medium. So when I moved in with my grandmother and I discovered this archive, the whole issue of clicking or not the camera was kind of solved, because my grandfather had done that for me. This archive for me, it's a double of the world. Every possible photographable thing is somehow contained already in these volumes of photographs. But interestingly enough, even though it's a family album, it's not quite common. It has some particularities. My grandfather thought of himself as an extremely handsome man, and he certainly was. And he was obsessed with American Westerns, and he saw every single Western that was ever filmed. And he started to disguise himself as a cowboy and staging some photographs, mimicking with some of the most Western films we've all seen, and almost kind of doing like a pre-Cindy Sherman style of work. So what I would like to show you now, it's one of these interesting self-portraits that my grandfather did of himself. It's actually not only a self-portrait of him pointing a revolver to his head, but it's also a collage where we see a grid in the background, we see a chart, we see several years that go down from 1959 till 1965, July 65 to be precise, but there's no more context in there. And one wonders, I mean, what was going wrong for him at this stage of his life. This collage was glued next to some pictures where you see young kids. I don't know if maybe he was just stressed about the fact of having 3 kids to raise, or maybe he was just being humorous about everything. I've been asking around to some family members if they have some clue of what this collage really meant to my grandfather, but no one really knows, since he was such a private man. And it's curious now that I've transformed him into such a public figure. No one really knows what was the purpose of this collage. So that
what was your grandfather's like profession in real life? What was he doing?
He was a salesman for a Canadian aluminium company called Alcan, and he was selling those products door to door, among other things. But that was his main daily job. Actually, he retired quite young and shut the door at the age of 50-something, and almost never went out again of his house, only during the weekends to help my grandmother to install her work in several parks around Mexico City, where artists display their work for tourists that come from abroad. But he really knew about lockdowns.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
it seems that that possibly triggered his imagination. He was also a refugee from the Spanish Civil War in Mexico. He arrived in the 40s to Mexico City. And I guess when you arrive as a kid from your place of birth to a different country, and you grew up in that country, but in a ghetto of Spaniards, you never really feel 100% Spanish, neither 100% Mexican. And then, of course, having the influence of the States so close to Mexico, I wonder if all these self-portraits that he did of himself are just a quest or a search of identity issues. I'll go further into this when I'll show you some actual works from the exhibition.
You know, that has been a thread going around most of the participations that we had in one way or another, the issue of migration and identity quest, which sounds very cliche and obvious, appears in such poignant ways. And I feel like this is a very specific one, you know, I
I
mean,
think
what migration does to identity, but I mean, it's
exactly. It seems that even my grandfather was not probably doing it consciously. It
absolutely.
seems that it was like a Freudian act. One could say. Uh,
Yep.
so I've been having in mind this collage since I
Mm,
first inherited this material back in the year 2000, and I've been willing to work with it one way or another, to use it for a specific purpose, since it's kind of neutral. It's inviting us to really think what's really going on there, what's the drama. And it was not until recent years, or recent months actually, that something started to make sense with this particular collage and my own personal interests. I started collecting music since I was quite young, in the
hmm
early 90s. But at that time, of course, I didn't had any money to buy a turntable or vinyl records.
hmm
So I was just collecting CDs, and at a specific moment, I had treasured such a big collection of CDs that it really didn't make sense to change the format and go analog and start buying vinyls. But
hmm
2 years ago, I had a show in Mexico City with Curimansuto Gallery, and I managed, well, the gallery managed to sell some work. So I decided, well, now it's the time to really buy a turntable finally, and maybe start collecting jazz records, which is the type of music that I hear and that I like the most,
hmm
which in
hmm
fact was also the type of music that my grandfather used to hear, and my father as well. So there's an
hmm
interesting, I guess, tradition happening there.
hmm
So suddenly, some of these records that I started to buy somehow resonated with the collage that my grandfather did. This
hmm
drawing included in a fabulous record by Keith Jarrett, Personal Mountains, somehow made me think of this red
Absolutely.
line going all the way down to the precipice. But not only that, also this wonderful Andrew Cyril record that uses splendidly a grid to place one single image in two different ways of organizing that same picture, that it somehow made me think again of the gridded background of this chart. And also, for instance, this wonderful photograph of a sculpture,
Mm.
one could say, a very playful one. It kind of reminded me of an early Carl André work, also of Damian Ortega work. He did a piece called America in the 90s that somehow resembles this project that was used to illustrate this splendid record. So again, the playfulness in the spirit of this cover reminded me, of course, of the playfulness in the spirit of my grandfather's chart. And also, of course, the elegance of how he was dressed and how Andy Warhol's models used to dress. This is a cover designed by Andy Warhol that I don't know if my grandfather ever saw, but there's some interesting parallelisms. And the drama of this wonderful Matt Waldron trio cover is one of my favorite covers. It somehow resonates with Marcel Duchamp's Broken Glass, but Waldron managed to place a self-portrait of him in one of those glass pieces, which I find very inspiring. And lastly, this wonderful cover, A Touch of Taylor, that of course has a lot of playfulness, as in the previous collage that my grandfather did that I just showed you. So suddenly I started to realize that there were some parallelisms between how my grandfather photographed himself and also how some of the jazz musicians appeared photographed in the covers that probably he was listening and that I certainly listened. So I thought, shouldn't I try to push forward this and maybe build an archive of jazz record covers and see if I can start a game of memory where I find a match in the photographic archive to each of these photographs that appear in these selected covers. So that's basically what I did. I signed in a forum called Discogs. I downloaded 3,000 different covers where the playfulness and the use of photography had a special relevance to me and to my work. And once I had built that archive, I started the process of matching different images, different sources of images. So for instance, this is a very good example. We can see this wonderful Art Blakey cover, Indestructible. And I don't know, I may what you think, but the portrait of my grandfather on the right side kind of mimics
It's
Art.
absolutely.
So, well, I guess those were the stereotypes of the time. But I still find it fascinating that my grandfather managed to keep these photographs next to the photographs of family members. And this is, at the end, what happened. I managed to remove the text and all the technical information from the original cover and just replace the original picture with the newfound picture that belongs to the J.R. Plaza archive. And that same exercise gave birth to 60 different jazz covers from the J.R. Plaza. I won't bother you to death showing you all those 60, but I can show you some other examples. Like, for instance, this Charles Tyler photograph that I find the way he is looking, the way his gaze is not pointing to where you would expect he would be pointing, kind of matches again with my grandfather's gaze. There were some matches that were pretty obvious, as the previous one that we just saw, that it's almost like a blueprint of Art Blakey's photograph. But then on some other covers, there were different aspects that triggered the comparison or the matching procedure. It was maybe something that had to do with the humor of both pictures, or with a specific intention from the photographer, or maybe just an angle, or maybe just something gracious that was going on in both of these pictures.
So let me interrupt you for 1 second and recap a little bit for anybody who's just joined. This is a project that you made, taking an archive of photographs from your grandfather, like self-portraits that he did of himself, where your grandfather would like put himself in different positions, and you pair them with this collection of records, jazz records. I have a question for you. I think you mentioned this before, but I think it's important to remind audiences, I mean, because it's such an amazing material you're working from, this like raw material that you inherit. How many images are in your grandfather's archive?
There are almost between 3,000 and 4,000 photographs glued to the pages of these 30 binders. But also my grandmother eventually gave me a collection of 1,000 slides. And later on, when she saw that I was taking quite seriously the job of doing something with this family legacy, she started giving me almost everything that belonged to my grandfather. His closet, his books, his personal documents. I remember once when I managed to sell the first artwork produced from the JR Plaza archive. She couldn't believe it. She told me, "I never thought you were such an intelligent man. I can't really understand how you are managing to make any sort of income from the pictures of your grandfather. This material was probably meant to be sold at a flea market, or maybe disintegrated by the humidity of a strange place, a strange warehouse, who knows." So she was really impressed, and since then she just gave me everything. So even though the origin of this work is mostly photographic, some other materials have been integrating the archive, and I've been also connecting the archive with elements that are outside of the archive. Actually, I mean, I worked with this material very intensely from 2000 till 2010, and from 2010 till nowadays, it's been more remote, my collaboration with the archive, but it's still curious that every time I finish a project, I think that I'm done with it, that it's the last one, and suddenly the archive has almost like its own voice, and suddenly it speaks for itself, and it says, no, 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 I want to keep on doing some exhibitions. Please put attention to this or to that. It's almost as if it had its own will. And of course, every time I do a project outside of the photographic archive, that project brings some new light to the archive. So it has become also like a game of mirrors. I do a project with the archive, and that shows light to maybe a different territory outside of the archive that I should explore, and that new exploration brings some light back again to the archive. So I'm in this back and forth condition, one could say. But at the beginning, I have to say, my interest was pretty much just about the photographic medium. And with the time, the figure of my grandfather has gained quite some space. He has become almost like a fictional character from a novel. It's very common now to hear from people that have been following my work that they say that I am making all this up, that this couldn't have happened, that my grandfather never really existed, and that he never really took that many photographs of himself. And it could be, of course, a possibility, but it's sorry to disappoint, but it's not the case. Um,
Well, I
anyhow,
think it's amazing. Just to make one comment about everything that you've been saying, I mean, I think it's very emotivo and almost like very beautiful. This idea of this like past, it's not just an archive that you found, it's an archive of your own family. It's an archive that has to do with the history of what you are, right? What your family is. And I think it's very beautiful, this idea of this like gravitational force of history that is asking you to keep working on it. And that I can imagine, I mean, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that, but as an artist, must be, like there must be some times in which you must say, like, I need to do my own thing. I need to do something different from this. And this pull, must be so strong, but at the same time, it's beautiful. But before you comment on that, I also want to remind like the audience that we're talking, I mean, we're not just talking about any random archive, we're also talking specifically about the archive of a refugee, of a World War II refugee, right? Which is something that has a special force. I mean, even though he made this archive after the war, like this obsession about archives and memory, somebody who arrived to Mexico as a refugee, even if he was a little boy, this like trauma, like, like generational trauma that were created on, I mean, my grandparents also, even though my grandparents were born in Argentina. But the
sure.
grandparents came from, my great grandparents came from Poland. And things like this. So I think this is something super important to have in mind, because there's this tendency towards the archive in contemporary art, especially in conceptual art, but this is like a very specific one,
Absolutely. I was pretty shocked to see a very interesting reaction back in 2003 when I did the first major installment of the archive at the gallery that I used to work with here in Mexico. I showed at that time in an exhibition called 5 Minutes to Die, after a title my grandfather used for a Western script he wrote.
Wow.
Yes, he managed only to translate into English the title of the script. Everything else was in Spanish, and it seems that he even dared to send that script to Hollywood. And of course, no one answered. But I at least managed to use that title for something else. And back then, the exhibition had to do with all the vertical pictures of the archive. I basically rephotographed all the vertical pictures and then enlarged them or decreased them, all of them to the same size, 8 by 10 inches, and then hanged 1,000 photographs in 6 walls of the gallery space. It was like a huge wallpaper where in 5 minutes you could see how photography was born, how it grew and how it died, from its black and white origins to the color digital prints final days of it. But also, since the photographs were vertical and not horizontal, what we saw back then in this collection of images were pretty much a history of self-portrait photography, where you, in 5 minutes, saw a man again being born, growing up, and eventually dying. So that's been by far the most visited exhibition I've ever done, but not because it was a great exhibition, but because it was sort of a mirror of the Spanish community living in Mexico. They all went to the gallery to see this collection of photographs, and they really didn't see there my grandfather or my mother or my grandmother. They were actually seeing their own history, because at the end, family albums have lots of things in common. And even though they are very, very personal and extremely particular, at the end, they don't speak to you about my family. They rather help you to open your own personal mental archive of images and memories. So you're right. That's something that was very, very interesting to see. But to comment a little bit on your previous reflection, sure, there's also psychological, I guess, quality also on my behalf to be interested in this particular family archive. My father died when I was barely 4 years old. And of
Oh.
course, I had to replace him with somebody else. And instead of maybe choosing my grandfather, which I choose one way or another, I choose his photographic legacy because I can construct my own memory using that legacy. When you don't have a paternal figure, you lack of paternal memories. And this material gave me the opportunity to construct my own paternal memory using my own will and my own wishes and my own possibilities to do that. But of course, as you were mentioning, every now and then I hear the voice of my psychoanalyst telling me you should stop paying attention to your paternal
Or not.
figure. Or not, exactly. One can be rebellious every now and then to those paternal figures that are
Like the psycho,
psychoanalysts as
like the
well, no?
psychoanalysis we all. I mean, I'm so obedient to my psychoanalysis. Can I ask you one more thing?
Sure.
I mean, not to get too personal, but also to give some context and to understand. Did you? I mean, your grandfather passed away. You know, you got to meet him, right?
No,
Or
I
did
did, I
you? Or
did,
how
I
long?
did, I
For how
did meet
long?
him because he died in the year 2000. I was
Mm.
born in 1981, so I had quite some time to spend, yeah,
You got a
many,
lot of
many.
time. Yeah.
Exactly,
But you talk
exactly.
about him like if you hadn't met him, like your connection with him through the archive. It's so fascinating that the way you.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because, of course, even though I even traveled
Mm.
with him and I spent quite some time with him, he was the most silent person I've ever met. And
Wow.
he was also extremely intelligent and poignant. So whatever you said, it could be turned to you. So I was very worried not to
Mm.
disappoint him. So I have
Mm.
to say, even though, and of course, when you're a kid, you don't have that much to share with a grandfather of yours. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and now in these days, I would definitely have much more things to share with him because we have so many things in common, the passion for literature and music and film. But back then, when I was a kid and I just care about football and partying and girls and so on and so on, there was nothing really there to share, although he was a constant figure. And I guess
Yeah.
that's why I keep on being inspired by him. And
Did
that's
he talk about his photographs and especially his self-portraits? How did he talk about them?
not with me, really,
Mm.
because he was very also protective of his belongings. Just to
Mm.
put you an example, he had a very distinguished library, and every now and then somebody asked for a lended book, and he would lend you the book. He was generous enough as to lend you the book, but then he would use a rubber stamp and stamp the pages of the book, every 15 pages, a legend that said, "Give it back to me, J.R.
No,
Plaza." So, of course,
no.
a little kid
Every 15
wandering
pages.
around.
Wow.
So certainly a young kid wandering around the pages of his photographic legacy was probably not the most desired thing by him. So I never really got to share. I actually, I mean, have to say that I have maybe this childish attitude towards the archive. As soon as my grandfather died, I had the opportunity as a young kid to squeeze in the drawers and the closets and see what was hidden there. So it's pretty much about revealing those secrets that were there unavailable for a young kid that I was back then.
That is amazing.
So uh, I still
You want to
have
keep showing
some
some
covers to.
images? Yes, let's
Sure,
see the
absolutely,
images because
absolutely.
we got sidetracked and we can keep talking, but
There's
yeah. While you show the images, let me
there's
just tell the audiences that they can start sending some questions. I saw one question, which I'll make in a moment. But if you want to send any questions, you can write them on the comments there, or you can also send them to the question section. Sorry, keep talking.
Sorry, no. So again, I found this Dudley Moore portrait very close in angle and in spirit to this portrait that my grandfather did of himself. I mean, who takes a photograph of himself eating almost a flower or holding a flower between your lips? Only I think Picasso did a portrait of him and my grandfather. And this is how the replacement of the Dudley Moore cover eventually looked like.
Definitely.
And this is again a fabulous photograph that was used to illustrate this wonderful Bobby Timmons record that I decided to pair with this photograph of my grandfather that is kind of looking towards the sky, as well as Bobby Timmons is on the previous image. And finally, I mean, this is one of my favorite record covers from John Henderson. And I mean, it was kind of impossible, I thought, to find 3 different angles of my grandfather smoking. And surprisingly enough, he did it. I don't know if having in mind this cover or not, but here we can see the second one. Here we can see the third one. And here we can see how the JR Plaza cover eventually looked like in opposition to Joe Henderson's Mode for Joe one. And it's really funny to see on the right side of my grandfather's set of portraits, a background photograph of a kid. I don't know if it's too small for you to see it. Here's my finger pointing out at this, curious secondary detail from behind. So this was just a small taste of some of the matches that I did. But as I was explaining before, I managed to find 60-something different matches. And that gave birth, as I was explaining at the beginning, to an exhibition called Jazz Covers from the JR Plaza at Gallery Nordenhake, Berlin, that was opened on March 13, closed on March 14 to the public, and now it has been updated, the closing date, till August the 1st. Hopefully, but by then, the restrictions in Germany are more subtle and some visitors can see this exhibition live. So this was the invitation for the exhibition. It was also an advertisement we used for Art Forum magazine. And I finally think that this collage that my grandfather did now has a proper use. It was so kind of neutral when he did it that it kind of needed some extra explanation. And now it finally has. That chart can, one way or another, reflect the opening and closing of an exhibition, and also, of course, the sales of the exhibition, how they certainly went down the hill.
Yeah, and you know, I was about to comment before, but I didn't want to interrupt you because you started talking about another one of their covers. But I mean, the idea of the chart has become so prevalent in the images that we see every day at the news. I don't think we ever saw as many charts as
exactly. I mean,
now,
in my
graphics and
in my vocabulary, the sentence "flattening the curve" hadn't been used never, and now it seems that it's the most common thing to say many times a day. So hopefully the coronavirus curve can eventually look like the curve my grandfather drew in this chart.
Totally.
So
Totally.
I can now proceed to show you the same images that I've seen from the
Yeah.
show. I haven't, as I was explaining before, being able to see physically, to be physically in the space looking at the exhibition. But this is the display of two of the walls of the gallery space. And here we can see two other walls. There's only 4 walls in the gallery space, and they were
Mm-hmm.
fully occupied by 20, there's 3 walls, sorry, 3 walls, and they were fully occupied by 20 different covers in each wall, but leaving some gaps, leaving some empty spaces in this grid that we also draw on pencil directly on the wall. Because, of course, when you are dealing with history, you're
Yeah.
always forgetting something. You're always leaving something behind that could have been useful for the purpose. And also, at the time, music, the industry, and well, what wasn't dominated by male figures. And I tried hard to include as many as female jazz musician covers as I could, and I only managed to do so for 3 or 4 cases. So those empty spaces are also meant to fill with that kind of impossibility of material.
Yeah.
Another wall,
Mm-hmm.
another composition, and then at last a detail that I'm not so sure you can see the pencil grid drawn here, but well, it's somewhere there drawn. And the
Uh-huh.
grid was not actually a closed grid. The last squares, so to speak, were open. You didn't. It was not a closed figure. So in that sense, you had the feeling that you could also play around and exchange at least mentally the covers from one wall to another. I had the feeling that being present physically at the exhibition, it could have been interesting to also do an interesting experiment of pairing some of the covers and moving them around in this grid, as I had previously done with the photographs of my grandfather and the jazz album covers that I selected for this project.
I
And
have a question. Sorry, you can finish.
no, please, please.
I have a question that actually has to do a little bit with what you just mentioned and this idea of arrangement. 2 questions. The first one that we had before, somebody asked if you have this archive online, if this is
Uh,
something that you have online
no, it's a
or
very
not.
good question because
Mm.
it's something that I decided not to do
Okay,
consciously.
good.
Because if I digitalize the archive and
Yep.
then I have it in high resolution stored in several hard disks, the most easy thing is just to select some images and print them digitally. But
Mm.
that's precisely what I don't want to do. I don't want to become a lazy artist that only works with a single medium because it's the medium you have at hand. So if you don't digitalize the images, then you are forced to think which is the best way to reproduce those original photographs depending on the project you want to do. And also for me, the archive, it's not just the photographs inside the archive, it's also the binders, the materials were used to build those binders, the dust that has been accumulated in those binders, and also many of the photographs that I've been working with, I remove them from the archive. So every time I see again the archive, I'm forced to see new images, because if
Absolutely.
I keep always the archive arranged in the same way, your memory plays you tricks and you end up always feeling attracted by the same group of images. So
Mm-hmm.
that's why I haven't digitalized the archive. I've only digitalized the images that needed to be digitalized for a specific purpose. But not every single work that I've done, it's a digital image from the archive. Sometimes I photograph the images with film, or sometimes I make photocopies, or sometimes I make a drawing out of it. Who knows? I mean, I prefer to put much more attention to the investigation and to the ideas that come through that investigation, and not let the medium actually hold the project in its hands by itself. So the only time that I've managed to digitalize a big chunk of the images was for an online project hosted by DIA Center for the Arts in New York, where again, this idea of pairing images happened, but instead of pairing an image with another image, I was trying to double that image with a list of words. How can you somehow describe a photograph by using the words your vocabulary allows you to do so, and then indexing those words to the image and allowing digital viewers to finally navigate through the selection of photographs I digitalized through words. It's a project called Words and Photos, and I was just basically trying to redouble again the archive. If the archive for me is a double of the world, why don't make a new copy of it, but by a different mean, in this case, words. And well, isn't it internet a double of the world as well? So I found it
We're about to find out. I mean, we're about to find out for real with this crisis. I mean, if this keeps going on, we're going to be forced to answer that same question you said.
Exactly.
Let me just highlight, I mean, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but let me just highlight that what you just said is also a response to a question that Cristobal G had, that said, Hola Iñaki, in one question, by working with the archive of your grandfather, you're also building an archive of your own. How do you understand the relation between the two archives?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, sadly, I don't have kids to maybe keep on with the chain of collaborations. I only have two dogs that couldn't care less about what I do, and also couldn't care less about the coronavirus. And that's been helping me to see things with a happier face, of course. But certainly that's something that in the future it might be interesting to see if what I have been doing can be reused by me or by some other artist eventually. That was a question that came out when we did the DIA project, because a big percent of the archive is there online and people can download it and do something with it. And I'm, of course, completely open to it, being myself a robber, as well as my grandfather was. He was copying stills from films and making photographs, identical photographs from those film stills. Well, there's a change of robbery here that I am opening, and it should continue, of course.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I don't know. So we have about 10 minutes before Instagram is going to cut us off. I always feel like, especially on Fridays, we end up having a lot of fun in this TV show or whatever this is.
Yes.
And we are like dictatorially cut off by Instagram. So I want to make sure that if anybody in our audience has any question, please make them now, so that we have an opportunity to share with him. But so, I mean, I guess a question for you, which is a little bit over here, but again, it's Friday. I'm having wine, and I hope everybody, cheers, everybody, for the weekend to come. We still should have weekends, even though days look all the same. And I mean, a question for you has to do with this idea of virtuality and this like tension in your work in between what you want to do analogical and what you want to do, what you're willing to do digital. Um, I mean, how do you feel about that with regards to the times we're living? I mean, without getting too dramatic, because we don't know what times we're living. This might be over in 2 weeks, or this might be over in 5 years.
Sure. No, for me, the opportunity to be on a lockdown seemed like
Mm,
the perfect retreat to work, concentrated on something that you never really have the time
mm,
to
yeah,
work for. To maybe finally find the time to open all the books that you buy and never really had the time to read, to every time I finish a project, I end up having all these collection of souvenirs from the project that I really don't know if I
yeah,
should keep them or throw them. And it seemed like the perfect opportunity to finally decide what to do with all this. But I have to say, it hasn't been the case. Sadly,
for
I've
any of us.
been completely overwhelmed by domestic activities, exercising the dogs, cleaning the house, being in
Yep,
contact with friends and family members, being very well informed, listening or president in the morning, the health I don't know the word in English, but the health minister at night. And if we
yep,
eventually in Mexico have to go to our balconies and clap our doctors at 7 o'clock, I won't have time to do that. I'm terribly
yep,
busy. So it hasn't been really the time I thought it was going to be. I haven't been able to work a single day since March the 15th that I've been
yep.
in strict quarantine since then. I guess eventually I'll start finding some time to do something more productive. But for now, I'm feeling just happy with swiping the floor and cleaning the dry leaves and being occupied with more real and physical
Yeah,
activities.
yeah.
But I've never used social media in my life. It's the first time I'm actually just
It's
starting to
an
use
honor. Thank
Instagram.
you.
Thanks to you. So now it really seems that it's like the perfect moment to start using all these platforms, maybe in a creative way. But I am
Yeah.
completely late. I am arriving to a party that I guess it ended already quite some time ago. But still,
Well,
who
you know the
knows? I
saying,
mean,
los últimos serán los primeros. The
exactly.
last
So,
would be the first. I mean, we say that in Spanish. Um,
absolutely,
uh,
absolutely.
I want to transmit somebody, Rardo Architects, is saying like, greetings from Barcelona. It's always a pleasure to hear you, Iñaki.
Thank you so
And
much,
so,
and thanks to all our friends and colleagues from Barcelona that are still awake at 11, almost 12 o'clock at night. I send you all a big hug, and I'm really, really grateful for staying you this late up. I really appreciate it enormously.
no, yeah, we also have Project SD thanking us for the talk. And I think we're gonna have to wrap up because otherwise we're gonna be cut in only a few more minutes, and it's better to say goodbye in an organized way. and
Absolutely.
and Iñaki, this was beautiful, and I know I already forced you into social media, and that this might be too much. I feel guilty forcing you into social media because I feel social media is at the same time the worst and the best that happened to all of us.
No, thank you. On the contrary, it's good that you
But
took
we
the.
love seeing your work. We love seeing your work. So that's the good thing about artists. I mean, you have the excuse to show, you can show your work and not your persona if you don't feel comfortable about that. But I mean, I feel your project and especially this project, but many others of you, like in general, your work is very important. And this is great. So thank you.
I appreciate it very much. Thank you so much for your comments, for your time, for your patience,
Gracias.
for the invitation, and for taking me out of the Middle Ages. And I guess I'll be using Instagram now in the upcoming days.
Hopefully. Okay, thank you everybody, and
Thank you
have a
to
great
everybody.
weekend.
Have a
Gracias,
great night.
Iñaki.
Good afternoon.
Bye bye.
Saludos.
Buen
Ciao,
fin
ciao.
de.